Hello, JennyEason here. I'm titling this Space Cult Wizards and the Soul Hustle. I'll be talking about the founder of the Church of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, and his connection to Jack Parsons, who I didn't know a lot about, and Aleister Crowley, which we hear his name come up a lot. I did not know the connection L. Ron Hubbard had to Aleister Crowley. So let's go in. I found a few fragments of articles and websites, and I just want to put together a picture so we can see what's going on here. Now, at the time, we're talking about the mid-1940s, about 1946. This was a time when Jack Parsons was trying to incarnate an entity, an extraterrestrial entity, and he had claimed to meet an entity from Venus in the desert of New Mexico. And this would be seen as an odd foreshadowing of claims that would later be made by people that would come in contact with extraterrestrial entities. Flying saucers. So after he and L. Ron Hubbard got together and did rituals together, because L. Ron Hubbard also wished to bring an entity from the other world into manifestation. But L. Ron Hubbard lacked the technical knowledge to do it. So he teamed up with, as the writer of this one article says, the innocent sex magician, Jack Parsons. So let's talk about Jack Parsons, because I was not familiar with him, like I said, and you may be, but let's just look at his background. He is said to have been the father of rocket science and the founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, that is in Pasadena, California. He was an enigma of a man. He lived a double life, one of science by day and dark magic by night. Although he believed the two were one in the same. He conjured spirits and ancient deities, and he delved into sex magic. He believed he had no limits and could manifest energies just as real as the once believed impossible science he helped create. His known associates were eccentric and somewhat controversial. His mentor was none other than cult leader and Prince of Darkness, Aleister Crowley. Parsons even became a priest for Crowley's Order of Thelema. Parsons also became friends with Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard and ended up contributing to much of Scientology's foundation. As he and Hubbard would discuss magic and philosophy for hours on end, as a brilliant scientist, it wasn't long before his unorthodox personal life began to affect him professionally. Much like pet owners who begin to resemble their animals, this mad genius began to mirror his work. becoming highly explosive. In the end, he became too unpredictable to work with, and one of his experiments ended up leading to his death at 37 years old. Aleister Crowley mentored Jack Parsons. According to Crowley, he had a revelation in Cairo, Egypt, in which the spirit Aiwas dictated an entire prophetic text to him. This text became known as the Book of the Law. This acid trip became a religion and a way of life for Jack Parsons and many others. It was the occult philosophy of Thelema, founded by Aleister Crowley, that Parsons adhered to. In the late 1930s, Parsons joined Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, in Los Angeles, and partook in their drug-fueled, sexually charged rituals. Parsons even eventually was named a priest of the Los Angeles chapter. Trigger warning: he ate menstrual cakes with his cult. As part of the OTO, Crowley and Parsons would perform the Gnostic Mass, which Crowley devised as a perversion of the Catholic Mass. During the Mass, an altar of candles and hieroglyphic patterns stands together with an upright coffin on a black and white stage, awaiting the ceremony's officiants to emerge. In the coffin, the priest awaits the arrival of the priestess, who, once she makes her entrance, leads the ceremony and prayers along with the priest. During their unholy version of the Eucharist, participants drink wine and eat the cake of light, made with menstrual blood. Yes, as in actual cakes made with actual menstrual blood inside them. He bought a mansion for sex magic and all things hedonistic. With all Parsons' rocket science genius, he became pretty rich naturally. What did he do with his riches? Well, he bought a mansion on Pasadena's Millionaires Row and welcomed his sex magic cult into it with open arms. And it quickly became a den of hedonism. In addition to housing all the OTO's operations, all sorts of eccentrics became frequenters of the parsonage, as they called his home. Science fiction writers, poets, Manhattan Project scientists, self-proclaimed witches, the house was always full of people, many of whom donned strange masks and costumes during their stay. He made his marriage a foursome after seducing his wife's 17-year-old sister. Now, there is an account that she was younger. I've heard 13 years old. Apparently, there was no line Parsons wouldn't cross when it came to sex. Ritual sex, adulterous sex, and even incest. It was all fair game to him. With the encouragement of his church, Parsons began having a sexual relationship with his wife's 17-year-old sister. Again, adjust the age and go down. Her name was Sarah. His wife, Helen, started sleeping with another man around the same time. He was a senior member of the church. The four of them decided to move into the parsonage together and continue to have multiple sex partners while also engaging in group sex for ritual and recreational purposes until Jack and Helen Parsons finally divorced. He became frenemies with L. Ron Hubbard, who stole his girlfriend. All the drama, right? After crossing paths with Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard, Parsons quickly fell under his spell because L. Ron Hubbard was described as one of the most charismatic people, very manipulative and very clever. So Parsons fell under L. Ron Hubbard's spell. The two became friends and confidants. They fenced together, discussed philosophy and magic. The two were even rumored to be sexually involved. I mean, why not? They're doing everything, right? I don't see why there would be any lines. It said earlier that there were no lines that Parson wouldn't cross. So that makes sense. By 1945, Hubbard was now living in the parsonage, Jack Parsons' house. Hubbard greedily worked his way through many women in his time at the parsonage, right on through, in fact, to Parsons' girlfriend, Sarah. Sarah became quite taken with the science fiction author. She and Hubbard ended up founding Scientology together. After Parsons' lover, sister-in-law became enamored with L. Ron Hubbard, Parsons turned to his trusty old black magic. He became obsessed with researching things like ghost and poltergeist and decided to conjure up himself a new lover. Can you imagine? That's right, he decided to summon up an elemental to be his new girlfriend. And the ritual involved him embedding onto magical tablets to the sound of music. Now, not the sound of music, what you're thinking, not that sound of music, but music. I'm not sure what music. We could look into that more. If you know, drop it below. It was after one of these rituals in 1946 that Parsons met his soon-to-be second wife, Marjorie Cameron. He was convinced his ritual had worked, and she was his elemental. She was even the inspiration behind his book of poetry titled Songs for the Witch Woman. L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons teamed up to perform an Enochian magical ritual called the Babylon Working, which basically involves trying to incarnate an actual goddess. The ritual took weeks, during which the two men engaged in ritual chanting while waving swords in the air and drawing occult symbols. Then they broke out the runes and dripped animal blood on them. Finally, They attempted to impregnate magical tablets by embedding on them together. News of this got back to Aleister Crowley, and he was appalled. Now, that takes things to another level when Aleister Crowley was appalled by what these two men were doing out in the desert. The founder of a sex cult, the guy widely known as the wickedest man in the world, was appalled. In a telegram, he called Parsons a weak fool and insisted L. Ron Hubbard was a swindler taking advantage of Parsons. He was right. Hubbard just gained Parsons' trust, stole his girlfriend, and ran off with all of his life savings under the guise of a business investment that Parsons never saw again. Those who worked with Jack Parsons, especially members of his rocket suicide squad, would often hear him recite a poem to Pan that was penned by Aleister Crowley while he worked on his rocket experiments. Sure, this could be a little strange, but the real issue was his excessive lifestyle spilling out into his work. According to this author, he felt that the more strange part was that his private work life was starting to suffer there. Okay, his devil-may-care attitude led to dangerous behavior that put the business at risk. He'd have not-so-subtle affairs with secretaries and host duels out on the rocket testing range. Wow, he was acting cray. He and Edward Foreman would literally fire off guns at each other's feet, trying not to flinch. What a workplace. On one occasion, Fritz Zwicky insisted on a particular type of rocket fuel that Jack Parsons didn't want to try. So he went out to where this fuel was being stored and blew up the whole batch. He literally blew up inventory. All the negative attention Jack Parsons and his mansion of black magic and debauchery, the parsonage, was attracting led to an FBI investigation. Parsons' cult involvement seemed like it could be a threat to national security. By day, he was a rocket scientist working for the government, and by night, he was jumping out of coffins, eating minstrel cakes, and trying to conjure up poltergeists to have sex with. Naturally, the FBI got a little worried about his headspace. Now, did they? They found no sign that he was a real security risk. It didn't matter, though. As the Cold War set in, people were being frozen out left and right for being alleged communists or sympathizers. After World War II, Parsons and several of his colleagues ended up losing their security clearance. The government didn't have room for people with quirkiness. After having created his own branch of science and then being squeezed out of it, Jack Parsons decided to create his own magic as well. He didn't want to just work Aleister Crowley's spells, Parsons was convinced he could combine science with magic and explore all of the physical and metaphysical realms. It was a rebellion against the very concept of limitations to the human experience. He didn't see himself or humankind as a race that needed to stay tethered to the earth. Space travel, dimensional travel, it was all possible in his mind, and he set out for the physical evidence to prove it. He threw himself into his magic. In time, OTO members actually started worrying about Parsons' sanity. His nonstop attempts at manifesting things were really starting to freak them out. One member, Jane Wolfe, wrote about her concerns to another member, Carl Germer. Quote, "There is something strange going on. Our own Jack is enamored of witchcraft, the Humbert voodoo. From the start, he always wanted to evoke something, no matter what. I am inclined to think, so long as he got a result." After being ousted from the rocketry game, Jack Parsons took on consulting jobs and did some pyrotechnics for the film industry. So it wasn't strange that he had explosive materials in his possession at the time of his death. It was the type of materials and how they seemed to have been handled that was suspicious. It was June of 1952. Jack Parsons and his conjured up elemental of a wife, Marjorie, were planning a trip to Mexico after he finished up a few things in his lab. It seems that while working with an extremely volatile chemical, there was an explosion involving mercury in Parsons' lab. He was still alive when police arrived, but not for long. Half of his face was missing, his jaw and skull were exposed, his right arm had been blown off, and his legs were in a crumpled heap, positioned unnaturally before him. Surrounded by occult documents, he was apparently trying to tell the paramedics something about the explosion, but his injuries made him impossible to understand. He died from his injuries, and upon hearing the news, his mother overdosed and died as well. Very tragic. It appeared he was mixing chemicals in a can, which he dropped. His death was ruled an accident, but this scenario involves the founding father of rocketry stirring highly sensitive chemicals in a tin can, which seems highly unlikely. In another twist, there was also a morphine-filled syringe found at the scene, suggesting Parsons was drugged. Those who knew him scoffed at this being an accident, claiming Parsons was too careful and meticulous, and he wouldn't be using a tin can to mix anything. And according to chemical engineer George Santimers, the explosion had to have come from beneath the floorboards. This led to claims that Parsons was assassinated, that the explosion was a government cover-up. There was a theory going around that Howard Hughes had Parsons assassinated. Apparently, Parsons was believed to have stolen Hughes Aircraft Company documents. Some claimed it was the work Parsons had done for Israel at one point that motivated his assassination, and anti-Zionists killed him. Finally, others believed he died during an attempt to create a homunculus. I've heard that before. Some say Parsons was killed by police seeking vengeance. Parsons served as an expert explosives witness during the trial of Captain Earl Kynite. Kynite was a corrupt police officer who was accused of attempted murder and conspiring to set off a car bomb. Kynite ended up being convicted largely on Parsons' testimony and reconstruction of the car bomb. Because of this, and the fact that it was an explosion that killed him, some claim Parsons was murdered by police officers as vengeance for testifying against Earl Kynite. An artist believed, her name was Renate Dreux. She stated that Parsons' death was due to a ritual he had been performing. She theorized the explosion was caused by conjuring gone horribly wrong, and he summoned some kind of fire demon by mistake, she says. The rite was a combination of alchemy and the theory of preformism, which claims organisms develop from miniature versions of themselves. What he was trying to create was a homunculus, a teeny tiny creature of folklore, often compared to the golem of Jewish faith. Another source I came across, like I said, I found a few fragments, so these are things like blog posts, things like that, and articles. Apparently, a man named T. Allen Greenfield, who was a bishop of the OTO, this is his account, okay, titled The Rocket Scientist and the Guru. Star date 1946. Isn't that familiar to say star date? I can see how a lot of things like Star Trek has been influenced by this trio. All right. Now, at about the same time that Jack Parsons was trying to incarnate an extraterrestrial entity, he claimed that he had met an entity who was from Venus in the desert of New Mexico. This foreshadows how people started having contact with extraterrestrial entities after Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard were engaged in rituals in the desert. I will tell you more. Hubbard wished to bring this other world into manifestation, but he lacked the technical knowledge to do it. So he came to the, as they say, innocent sex magician Jack Parsons. In this version, the Babylon working, guided by L. Ron Hubbard, had little to do with Babylon and more to do with the hideous old ones of H.P. Lovecraft, Cthulhu, if I said that right, mythos. L. Ron Hubbard said that a door opened and something came through. He says that was the essence of his thesis. And the appearance of the first flying saucer case actually happened, like I said, the year after he and Parsons were doing these rituals. A coincidence? What do you think? The so-called Babylon working conducted by Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard were between January 4th and March 4th, 1946. And there's a lot of speculation, as you can imagine, a lot of mythologizing and wonder about what these two men were up to, because they were seen as these charismatic and brilliant bohemians of that period. Jack Parsons, again, was a major force in the early development of solid fuel booster rockets. He's the founder, again, of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, in Pasadena. So his work, eventually, they honored him. The International Astronomical Union honored him by naming a lunar crater after him. He served, we're talking about Jack Parsons, the rocket scientist, the rocket sex scientist. He served as a master of Agape Lodge OTO in the 1940s. Again, he died under these mysterious circumstances, an explosion in 1952. And L. Ron Hubbard, on the other hand, he was this science fiction writer. He was a freelance writer. He was often without money. I think he was just always looking for a scheme and a scam, but they said that he worked as a pulp fiction author. So he eventually founded the Church of Scientology, which brought in a whole lot of money, and he mentioned that. Actually, there's some quotes by him saying that you don't make a whole lot of money doing the writing thing, but yeah, making a lot of money doing the church thing. So he knew full well what he was up to. Now, the Church of Scientology continues to be at the center of stormy controversy, and just for decades. And both men were students of Aleister Crowley's sex magic. Now, L. Ron Hubbard was the megalomania that you can imagine anybody would be that starts their own church. His son, who turned into a whistleblower, Ron Jr., and by the way, his great-grandson is also a whistleblower. And I also want to mention, while I'm at it, Leah Remini, who is a whistleblower. Not sure about Leah Remini all the way, but it appears from what I have seen on the surface that she is sincere. Let me know what you think. So, L. Ron Hubbard Jr. said that his father, this is a quote, he said, "Secrets, techniques, and power I alone have refined, improved on, applied my engineering principles to, science and logic, the keys, my keys to the doorway of the magic, my magic, the power, my power, the real powers of Solomon." So he was very arrogant that he felt that he was improving on the sexual magic rituals of Aleister Crowley. So that gives us another another piece of information to understand the man behind this church. So L. Ron Hubbard made it clear that he was talking about the sex magic that's central to the OTO system. Okay? We cannot take away the fact that the OTO is connected to L. Ron Hubbard and everything that he started. So he felt that he put a unique twist on what Crowley did. So he says sex by will, love by will, no caring and no sharing, no feelings. Sex is the root to power. Scarlet Women, they are the secret to the doorway. Notate that women are used as doorways to, he says, use and consume, feast, drink the power through them, waste and discard them. Again, L. Ron Hubbard teaching this to his son. Now, they describe Jack Parsons as more of an idealist. So he invited Ron to live in his home after just knowing him 3 months. He felt that he was a gentleman, they say, and he had a girlfriend named Maggie, who she said transferred her sexual affections to L. Ron Hubbard. So Parsons was convinced. He wrote letters to Crowley, and he said that L. Ron Hubbard was in complete accord with their principles. And that's why he couldn't really fight him for taking his girlfriend, because, again, at the parsonage, they were having orgies, and this is part of the whole sex magic culture, so they can't get mad when someone takes off with their person, as you can see. Very complicated. So not only did Jack Parsons give up his girlfriend, but, again, going into a joint financial venture with L. Ron Hubbard. Now, Aleister Crowley, he wrote a letter to his successor, who would become his successor, one of the Grand Masters of the OTO, a German named Karl Germer. What a name. He said to Germer, now this is Crowley, he said, from our brother's account, he has given away both his girl and his money. Apparently, it's the ordinary confidence trick. Look at that. They tell you what they're up to, right? Another friend of Jack said, who witnessed all of this happening, this friend described Hubbard's role in this way. Ron was a persuasive and unscrupulous charmer, not only in social groups, but with the ladies. He was so persuasive and charmingly unscrupulous that within a matter of a few weeks, he brought the entire house of Parsons down around poor Jack's ears. And he did it by taking over Jack's girl for an extended period of time. So there you are. This is how L. Ron Hubbard, how he moved about. So again, it was against this background that Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard embarked upon this big sex magic experiment called the Babylon Working. This was seen as an elaborate sexual magic experiment designed to bring Babylon into physical manifestation. The whole concept of the magical child has several interpretations. Now, there's a more orthodox, they say, traditional view in which they say this magic is employed to manifest by the act of pure will a magical being, and trigger warning, they use the fluids from this act to use as a material basis, okay, for this magic. And a more literal interpretation holds that magical rituals such as the star sapphire will produce a moon child that is a living child who serves as a host to a super being. That is, the child is an avatar or an incarnation of their divine. So Crowley, they say, he wasn't really into what these two were doing, even though he was their teacher. So I'm not sure about the way, we have to also look at this through the filter of an OTO. This was his report. So he's making Aleister Crowley out to be someone who was laughing at these two people, and I can see how they can employ that kind of thing so that we don't take it serious what Parsons and Hubbard were doing, because according to this guy, Aleister Crowley called them idiots for what they were trying to do. I'm sure that you may agree with me, a few of you, that I don't think that he would think that of his star pupils, would he? He wouldn't look at them as crazy and out there, because according to the things I've learned about Aleister Crowley, he did all of that and worse, I'm sure. So, going on to Parsons' own description of this Babylon working is based upon the fundamentals of ceremonial and sexual magic. So Parsons outlined the entire experiment and the reasons for it. He said that the present age was under the influence of the force called, in magical terminology, Horus. This force, he said, related to fire, Mars, and the sun, to power, violence, and energy. And he said that the force is completely blind. It depends upon men and women, to whoever manifests this, to guide it. And there's a catastrophic trend that, due to the lack of understanding, that the hidden lusts, fears, and hatreds within people's own natures that they don't fully understand, he was explaining, results in the warping of the love urge. So they were aware, in fact, that's the goal, is to warp the love urge, the natural organic love urge. So he said that the result is homicidal and suicidal directions. However, it seems that Parsons also talked about balancing this out in this manifestation of Horus. So he mentions love, understanding, and some Dionysian freedom. And I'm not sure how they balance out a blind, powerful force, but that may be why he was seen as naive. So Parsons was also seen as more of the sound, reasoning person of the two. So he let his friend again come into his home, steal his money and his girl. And Ron Jr. also mentioned that his father explained to him that he was to use and discard the Scarlet Women. And when asked about the Scarlet, the father, L. Ron Hubbard, said scarlet is the blood of their bodies, the blood of their souls. Bend their bodies, bend their minds, bend their wills, and beat back the past. And I am recalling hearing that a lot of the techniques in the Church of Scientology is to erase the past memories. So maybe that explains it. Beat back the past. What do you think? So there was an essay written entitled Hollywood, Satanism, Scientology, and Suicide. And The Sun reported that L. Ron Hubbard, his father, was guilty of heinous abuses of women. He said that in his father's private circle, there were lots of women, lots of mistresses. And when he was younger, he participated in orgies with his father, with 3 or 4 women. And he said that his father's theory was that one had to open or crack a woman's soul in order for the satanic power to pour through it and into the man. It got kind of far out, he said, culminating in a variety of lewd acts. And he said that his father had an incredibly violent temper. He was into S&M, and he would beat his mistresses, and he would shoot them full of drugs. Now, this is the son is snitching. Now, when the person asked the son about the soul cracking, he said that it was a real long and complicated thing, but he tried to explain that there were some powers in the universe that were really strong. And he said that Hitler used the same kind of black magic that his father did, the same occult practices. They were identical, he said, and they stem clear back to before Egyptian times. So this predates Egypt. He said it's a very secret thing, but it's powerful, it's workable, and very dangerous. He said brainwashing is nothing compared to it. The proper term, he says, would be soul cracking. It's like cracking open the soul, which then opens various doors to the power that exists, the satanic and demonic powers. He said it's like a tunnel or an avenue or doorway that is used to pull power to yourself through another person using women. So he said it's very insidious because the women do not, some of them don't know they're being used this way. And he said that it is the ultimate vampirism. Instead of going for blood, they are going for the soul. And he said taking drugs in order to reach the state it turns a person into, he said, a literal psychic hammer that can break souls and pull power through. So, yeah, Crowley suggested, they say Crowley was at odds with this, so he felt that for these sex magic rituals that the person should be engaged fully in it and into it. So Parsons said that he was engaged in this study for many years. He was in supervision and the operation of occult lodges. Also, he was initiated into the sanctuary of the Gnosis by 3 individuals, I'll notate, and he decided at that time upon a magical operation designed to obtain the assistance of an elemental mate. He was really involved, like really obsessed, they said, with bringing forth an elemental mate because he had lost his girlfriend to L. Ron Hubbard. And so they say he was going for broke, all or nothing, to create a partner who was the magical child, which is strange. So January 4th, 1946, at 9 p.m., Parsons and Hubbard employed the powerful Enochian air tablet using an air dagger, parchment talisman, invocations, conjurations, Enochian calls, and invocations, and at various times, according to Parsons, over the days they were out in the desert, there were windstorms that were raised, electrical power was disrupted, and L. Ron Hubbard had a candle knocked from his hand by something, they say. And they witnessed a lot of weird things. This was out in the desert. Now, January 18th, they were out in the Mojave Desert. And Parsons had this epiphany, they say. And he realized that the experiment was done. So he basically felt that they had accomplished what they had gone to the desert to do. So when he returned, he found a young woman that met up with everything he was expecting. So this woman was waiting for him, he says. So for the next month, he was invoking stuff with her. And it was what they would call a sexual Eucharist of the Mass of this is blasphemous, but the Holy Ghost, they're saying. So his magical partner visited New York and received some sort of communication, and they identified the source as Babylon. The naming of this communication was by an entity called Babylon herself. And it should be noted that L. Ron Hubbard also was away. I guess they weren't working together. So Parsons did some weird things. I'm looking like something about the night of Pan and the mysteries of the goat and the serpent. And this is really strange stuff, but you know, they talk about tears and sweat and blood and the other stuff that comes out of men. So they're using this in these practices and putting them in a cup and just being naked, lusting, and all kinds of weird stuff, okay? So there were covens involved, okay? Secret things. And they felt that what they did was they shouldn't be ashamed of it, but they rejoiced in it and celebrated all of this stuff. Now, the person of the OTO mentions that a lot of this was the anticipation of the emergence of Wicca in the Western society, for this real emergence to get stronger for Wicca. And we did see a lot happening in that area. So not only the United States, but also in England. So Parsons spent much of that time of his short magical career writing on the subject of witchcraft. So prior, to his death. And when Parsons communicated this to Crowley, they say that Crowley was amused, but he was puzzled also. Now, apparently, L. Ron Hubbard returned. Parsons then was preparing to impregnate his magical partner. So I guess the impregnation time. And L. Ron Hubbard was participating in this. And he was really impressed by Hubbard's vision. Hubbard had this vision of a savage and beautiful woman riding without clothes on a great cat-like beast. Parsons was high priest, and he and Hubbard were having relations with the woman. This is so weird. Parsons was the high priest of that particular thing, so that was his girl. Hubbard, they say, was present, and he was acting as a scryer, a seer, and a clairvoyant during the intercourse. And this occurred on the first 3 days of March. The aftermath of this, they say, is of much rumor and points out the high significance of sexual magic. And again, Crowley taught that it was the secret and the true key to the magic. So this is why we see what we're seeing today. And Ron Hubbard nevertheless married Jack Parsons' former lover the following month, and then he went on to write Dianetics, the Science of Mental Health, and eventually, of course, started the Church of Scientology, built upon a hidden mythos of a 75 million year old disaster in which the inhabitants of a 76 planet galactic federation were blown up by a dictator named Xenu. This science fiction space opera from L. Ron Hubbard's Pulp Fiction days forms the bizarre underpinning to an already bizarre story. So it says that it depends on who you talk to of the people in the know as to the magical child that was conceived. So the ritual again was March 4th, 1946. And if that's the case, and there is, or they claim this to be a woman, so it would be a girl baby that would have been born, so that woman could be the vessel to bring forth whatever is what they're trying to bring forth, okay? So they also point out that while this was going on, there was the birth of modern second wave feminism also as a result of a lot of this, they're saying. And the arrival of the post-war baby boom is also running along with this in an eerie sort of way. UFO buffs have also a lot invested in this, because it says UFO buffs have of late been touting a theory that L. Ron Hubbard came to Parsons with a purpose more grandiose than the ordinary confidence game. In pulp magazine circles, he had encountered any number of occultists and border occultists, and had already formulated the core of the inner Scientology teaching. He wished to bring this other world into manifestation, and got all that technical knowledge from Jack Parsons, the rocket sex magician, and also a lot to do with the hideous old ones of the H.P. Lovecraft, bringing through those monsters, opening doors. So they say that the Babylon working permanently alienated Parsons from Crowley, but the work of the ill-fated rocket scientist has more recently been reevaluated in a more favorable light by present-day occultists and UFOologists alike. It gives a clear picture of how he set out to create a business, basically, a way to make a lot of money and to take advantage of people. I will follow this video up with an article that I want to share that gives more information about L. Ron Hubbard's wife, Sarah Northrup, and just to also talk a little bit about his great-grandson, who is a whistleblower against the church. So I want to thank you, and I want to follow up after this with a live stream. So I'll let you know Just stay tuned, but thank you, and I'll see you soon.